Our next speaker is Zdravko, the professor of German classical philosophy here at the University of Ljubljana. He has published the trilogy Automaton Transcendentale on Kant, and also another book on Kant called Three Studies in Kant's Practical Philosophy, as well as numerous articles, especially on Kant and Hegel. He's also the Slovenian translator of several classical works, including the Critique of Pure Reason, Hegel's Science of Logic, and Elements of the Philosophy of Right. So please.
Danke. Ich möchte Sie alle zuerst herzlich begrüßen. Dann muss ich aber um eine Entschuldigung bitten. Nämlich, ich wollte meinen Beitrag auf Deutsch geben. Warum? Weil ich denke, dass es aus kulturellen und politischen Gründen wichtig ist, dass man in verschiedenen Sprachen spricht, sagen wir. Leider, alas, habe ich aber keine Zeit dafür gehabt. Und so bin ich beim Englischen geblieben. Und also mein Vortrag wird auf Englisch gegeben werden. Dennoch, aber ich bitte um Entschuldigung, okay. The title of my paper is The Political Form of the Hegelian Concept on the Influence of Spinoza's Political Philosophy on Hegel's Metaphysics. And I will basically try to, let's say, verify this thesis. The thesis that it was Spinoza's political philosophy that may have influenced Hegel's conception or emergence of Hegel's new conception of reason, and thus his entire speculative philosophy in the late Jena period. And I will do it in 3 steps with an, let's say, open ending. It is not necessary, I believe, here to emphasize the massive presence of Spinoza in Hegel's formative years. Let us just recall 3 short points. First, the reception of Spinoza in Germany was shaped by the so-called pantheismus or the Spinozismus-Streit, as Jacobi famously declared that there is no other philosophy than philosophy of Spinoza. Hegel was formed under the impact of this conviction, and he initially read Spinoza in the light of Jacobi interpretation. Second, all 3 Tübingen roommates, Hölderlin, Schelling, Hegel, professed their sympathies for Spinoza. And this is particularly true of Schelling, who, in a letter to Hegel, 95, declared that he had become a Spinozist. We know that. And third, in 801, when Schelling finally published his philosophical system, the Identitätsphilosophie, this system was in form and content presented as a version of Spinozism. And I think that this has important implications for Hegel as well, for in the early Jena years, he was perceived and acted as a follower of Schelling. Even Hegel's procedure of Selbstvernichtung der Reflexion from the Differenzschrift is in this respect, we could say, a variant of Schelling's conception of cognition in which the finite is recognized as identical with the absolute. Considering the place of Spinoza in the early Hegel, we can say that Hegel became Hegel by distancing himself from Spinoza, distancing himself in a typically Hegelian manner by using a determinate negation. It is therefore no coincidence that in the place of strategic importance in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel declared, we know, es kommt meine Einsicht alles darauf an, das Wahre nicht als Substanz, sondern ebenso sehr als Subjekt aufzufassen und auszudrücken. The declaration obviously is so general that it lends itself to a variety of interpretations. However, it is quite natural to read it, as it was done before, in relation to Spinoza. And in my view, there are at least 2 different ways of reading it in relation to Spinoza in general and Spinozismus-Streit in particular. On the one hand, we must recall that according to Jacobi, any consequent philosophy necessarily leads to Spinozism, or philosophy and Spinozism. But since he presented Spinozism as a system of universal mechanism, it follows further that once the standpoint of philosophy is adopted, everything related to subjectivity, from freedom to art and love, turns out to be unthinkable and impossible. So, Jacobi continued, if we are not prepared to embrace such a consequence, we must also reject the premises from which it necessarily flows. And that is, we must reject the standpoint of philosophy. The alternative then would be either Spinozism or no philosophy, either substance or subject. Es gibt kein drittes. Hegel basically acknowledged the pertinence of Jacobi's diagnosis. As we know, he said in his lecture of philosophy, Spinoza ist Hauptpunkt der modernen Philosophie, entweder Spinozismus oder keine Philosophie. One can add, es gibt kein drittes. But even in his very early writings, Hegel rejected the alternative, asserting, es gibt ein drittes, sagt dagegen die Philosophie, und es ist dadurch Philosophie, dass ein drittes ist. According to Hegel, philosophy is bound to accept the universal validity of rational thought. This is, in a sense, the condition of its being philosophy. This is the other name, synonymous of to being philosophy. Thus, philosophy cannot but start by assuming the standpoint of the substance, if it wants to be philosophy. It is of equal importance, however, that it does not remain there, but is able, from this very standpoint, to produce the dimension of the subjectivity. The present task of philosophy would therefore be to remain faithful to philosophy, that is, to think through as substance, and yet, precisely by insisting on it, to succeed in thinking the dimension of freedom, life, and love, that is, to think the true also as subject. Let's say that this could be a material way of reading our programmatic declaration with reference to Spinoza. But the question remains how to do it, how to think what, according to Jacobi, philosophy is incapable of thinking. How should substance, so to speak, subjectify itself? At this point, we must proceed to what I would call formal reading of the declaration. In Jacobi's and Hegel's view, Spinoza was not only the main philosopher of substance, but also a paradigmatic example of a certain conception of thought, of a certain mode of demonstration, which he called mos geometricus. In fact, the two go hand in hand. The problem is that on this model of thinking, the thoughts are treated as things, and are held together by the same logic that characterizes mechanism. Nowhere is this more evident than precisely in Spinoza, who claims, we know, that ordo et connexio idearum idem est ac ordo et connexio rerum. But if ideas indeed behave like the paradigmatic billiard balls, then we are obliged to accept something like mechanism of ideas, beside the mechanism of the matter. Or, to put it in another way, in this case, along with the usual materialism of matter, we should also speak of materialism without matter. And this is what Jacobi did, use this expression. And this can only mean that as long as this conception of thought, this conceptual regime is in charge, we are still enclosed in the same metaphysics of substance. This is the formal definition of what is to stand on within the metaphysics of substance. And this is precisely Hegel's point in his programmatic declaration, I would say. In his view, Kant and Fichte replaced the traditional objective metaphysics with a subjective metaphysics. Yes, they did that. But otherwise, they left its metaphysical structure its model of rationality the same, intact. And since this is the decisive point, they thus both remained at the standpoint of mere substance. Therefore, in order to think the true also as subject, it is imperative to develop a different comprehension of the logical, eine veränderte Ansicht des Logischen, über das Logische, a new conceptual regime that would enable us to think what otherwise was unthinkable. In Hegel, the traditional mechanical mode of thinking is usually called Verstand, Vorstellung, and the new rationality is called Vernunft oder Begriff. The task of philosophy would therefore consist in replacing the conceptual regime of understanding with that of reason. Two very brief remarks, however. First, Hegel's declaration does not imply that we should abandon understanding altogether. On the contrary, it demands that we must still begin by thinking the true as substance. There is no other way. That is, that we must first take the standpoint of understanding. It is only on this ground that we can then proceed further to the standpoint of reason. How? According to Hegel, understanding is inherently marked by negativity that is bound to manifest itself in the form of open contradiction, if only we think its thoughts in a truly consequent way. Hegel insists that in spite of the contradiction, or in the face of this contradiction, we must still persist in thinking it through, and by this, what he called verweilen beim Negativen, transform the negative into the positive. It is at this point that understanding becomes reason. Second, on the formal or methodological reading, the access or elevation to reason involves also a gesture of subjectivation. In fact, in a situation of internal contradiction, especially if it is not arbitrary, it is impossible to find a solution by means of logical necessity alone. Resolution can only be brought about by something excessive, and this can only be provided by the subject in a gesture of subjective decision. Hegel was clear enough, I think, about this. In his discussion of the method at the end of the Science of Logic, he says, in diesem Wendepunkt der Methode kehrt der Verlauf des Erkennens zugleich in sich selbst zurück und so weiter. He speaks about turning point. And this is a turning point because at this point, the thinking must turn its scope away from the objective content of thought determinations to the subjective form of thinking itself. It is the point at which the subject is compelled to assume the task of thinking in the first person and, let us say, to force a resolution. It is at this point, I would say, that some sense subjectivize. Good. If then is in his speculative philosophy, Hegel became Hegel by moving away from Spinoza, what he perceived as Spinozism. We will now see that in the field of political philosophy, the progress was exactly the opposite. At the beginning of his philosophical career, Hegel was full of admiration for the Greek ethical life. He was convinced that the ideal political organization was realized in the city-state of antiquity, where each individual was animated by the spirit of the community, so that the particular and universal coincided directly. In sharp contrast to the present-day state, which imposes itself, Hegel's day's state, of course, but probably our present-day state as well, which imposes itself as something external and treats free men mechanically, the Greek polis was living, Hegel believed. It was organic. As each citizen existed only within the whole and for the whole. And it was beautiful, as there was no need for external constraint, everyone did what was required spontaneously out of immediate feeling. Thus, even in the Differenzschrift in 801, he still praised the true infinity of a beautiful community, referring to the Greek ethical life, and Sittlichkeit. And in the system of ethical life in 802, he continued to write that in the ethical life, the individual exists in an eternal mode, adding that his empirical being and doing is something downright universal. So once again, the immediate coincidence of the particular in its empirical reality and the universal. That was characteristic, supposedly, for Greek polis and for his idea of Sittlichkeit. But very soon, a year or two later, Hegel's position changed. On the one hand, he noticed that the Greek polis was not only beautiful, but also extremely fragile. As soon as a subject appeared in its midst, a subject that was prepared to insist on her particularity to the very end, as was the case with Antigone, the beautiful community was bound to perish. The problem was that there was no place in it for protesting, and Hegel said, es findet kein Protestieren hier statt, with an obvious allusion to the Protestantism. In this sense, the problem of the Greeks was that they were not Protestants. In this sense, the Greek polis turned out to be uncannily close to Fichte's overregulated police state, since they both weren't able to allow for the subjective particularity. And this was one, and on the other hand, Hegel now realized that within the state, affirmed that within the state, a space for such autonomy had to be opened. As early as 803, he asserted, I quote, der Mittelpunkt als Staatsgewalt, die Regierung, muss, was ihr nicht für ihre Bestimmung notwendig ist, der Freiheit der Bürger überlassen. Und ihr muss nicht so heilig sein, als das freie Tun der Bürger in solchen Dingen gewähren zu lassen und zu stützen, ohne alle Rücksicht auf Nutzen, denn diese Freiheit ist an sich selbst heilig. Now the epithet of happy people, das glückliche Volk, no longer refers to the Greeks, but to a people living in a state that maintains a space for free activity. Also das freie Tun der Bürger muss von dem Staate nun gestützt werden. Hegel now sees the defining feature of the modernity in this higher divide, where one knows oneself as the essence, and although separated from the existing universal, is still absolute. Although separated from the existing universal, is still absolute. The subject becomes absolute against the substance. What caused Hegel to change his position? As always, it was brought about by an interplay of different lines of influence, one of them being certainly the so-called new science of political economy. However, as has been convincingly shown by Kierkegaard, the most direct influence comes from Spinoza's political philosophy. It is known, namely, that in that time, Hegel collaborated with Paulus on his edition of Spinoza collected works. It is therefore certain that at least by then, he had become familiar with the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. That is clear, obvious. In addition to that, however, Kierkegaard has inventively demonstrated, to my opinion, that Hegel must have also read the Tractatus Politicus, and which is extremely important since the latter Tractatus Politicus inhabits a very different conceptual landscape. Interestingly enough, the two treatises are often treated together, you know, in the both treatises. No, there is a huge difference between the two, and that has to be stressed. Kierkegaard proved that he must have read Tractatus Politicus, and that some of Hegel's formulations come directly from there. Indeed, not only the pronounced rejection of political utopias, even the model of substance and subject, this time understood in the political sense, can be convincingly traced back to Spinoza's treatment of the relation between the state and the citizen in his Tractatus Politicus. As we know, Spinoza scandalously identifies right with power. And since the state consists of the multitude united, multitudo una velutimmente ducta, its power, and therefore, according to Spinoza, its right, over a particular seems to be unlimited, but only seems to be unlimited. Because Spinoza argues that the state cannot do whatever it pleases, for even the state has something to fear. In general, the state has no right to do anything that would lead to its ruin or diminish its power. It is, for instance, obliged to follow the precepts of reason. If it acts against the precepts of reason, the power of the state diminishes, so it acts actually against itself, and this is not an action, it doesn't come, and so on. Further, it has no right to do anything that would arouse the indignation of the majority or set the multitude against the government. And most interestingly, according to Spinoza, the state has no right to do those things that no one could be made to do under any circumstances. For instance, Spinoza says, no one can forsake one's faculty of judgment. And this means that however powerful the state may be, it is still bound to recognize the subject's freedom of thought, or else the state would perish. Or would be bound to perish. This is why we can affirm that in Spinoza's political philosophy, the true should be thought not merely as ethical substance, but also as subject. However, there is more, I believe. We have already seen that Spinoza's political philosophy had a marked influence on Hegel's political philosophy in the Jena period, and beyond. Indeed, Hegel's mature conception of the modern state is heavily indebted to Spinoza, even down to the very vocabulary. And my favorite example in this respect would be the use of indignatio in Spinoza and Empörung in Hegel, or unio in Spinoza und die Vereinigung als solche in Hegel. And there could be a whole list compiled in this sense. Now, however, this is then, let's say, clear. Now, however, we are going to suggest that this influence extended into the realm of speculative philosophy as well, even to the very form of Hegel's new conceptual regime. To this end, we must next turn to Spinoza's account of different political forms. Since for Spinoza, the power of the state is defined by the power of the multitude, his state is inherently democratic. The power always stems from people in Spinoza. In his view, the various forms of government, and following the tradition, Spinoza speaks of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. These various forms of government differ only in the question of who is in charge of the state affairs. But the sovereign is always the same. The power comes always from the same source, from the multitudo una velocemente ducta. However, each of these forms has specific instruments and is exposed to specific dangers. And so Spinoza develops a dedicated model for each of them. Let's say a kind of ideal type in which its basic principle is consistently applied to all state institutions. Monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy are thus, for Spinoza, at the same time, three different logics, three different regimes of political conceptuality. And let us now briefly examine one by one. First, democracy. And first, we must admit that, unfortunately, we do not know how Spinoza's theory of democracy looked like. Some indications suggest that he considered it the most perfect form of the government, since only therein the power is completely absolute, as Spinoza says. But it also seems that he considered it the most unstable form of government, since he believed that all states were originally democracy. But we see that by now they're not. So it's not the most stable and the most powerful form of government. But be that as it may, the chapter on democracy remained unfinished. As we know, composing it, Spinoza, a few pages too late, it was said, died. According to Spinoza, the difference between a democracy and aristocracy, to which we turn now, consists not in the number of those who participate in the government, but in the mode of their nomination. Whereas in democracy they are designated by the law, in aristocracy the so-called patricians are elected to the office. For Spinoza, aristocracy is primarily a system of elections, in which the permanently elected patricians elect new members of the Supreme Council, which handles the state's affairs. In describing the inner structure of an aristocracy, Spinoza paid a special attention to the relationship between the Supreme Council and the people. He insisted, for instance, that the number of elected patricians should be quite large, so that every individual member of society could entertain the hope of one day being elected to the Supreme Council. On the other hand, however, the fundamental principle of a robust aristocracy requires that the governing council, should be, as Spinoza says, independent and completely safe from the multitude. Independent from the multitude. Spinoza justifies these requirements by the great number and composition of the Supreme Council. Since it is large enough not to be subject to ordinary human weaknesses, since it is diverse enough to be directly informed of every single matter, and since it is composed of the best who are supposed to be guided by reason, it is safe to assume that the members of the council are capable of reaching the best decision on everything by themselves. And we could add by themselves only. And so Spinoza claims every declared will of the council must therefore necessarily be law. But in order to function well, it is essential that the Supreme Council is not interfered with or exposed to outside influences. Therefore, the patricians must be separated from the people, and aristocracy must be arranged in such a way that, I quote, the multitude would represent a minimal object of fear to the rulers. The people would thus be, quote, debarred both from offering advice and from voting. They would be debarred from offering advice. No one needs in aristocracy advice of any advice of the people, not to mention the voting. And in general, therefore, the people would have no political rights. And then at the end, monarchy. In monarchy, the exercise of power is in principle conferred on one, a prince, a king, or a monarch. But the power of one is essentially weak and precarious. Due to the inevitable limitations of human nature, one is unable to perform the task of governing alone, to have the knowledge to reach the best conclusions, or the strength to put them into practice. There is no figure more pathetic than a king thinking he's a king. His independence is in fact in inverse proportion to his supposed power, so that for his own safety, the king must rely closely on the multitude. This is the connection that Hegel, that Spinoza establishes in monarchy. I quote, "The king is most fully in control of his own right when he is most concerned for the welfare of his people." From there it follows, first, that the monarch needs counselors or advisors to conduct the affairs of the state for the common good. They will govern in the monarch's name, of course, so that any decree they make must be considered the monarch's will and be subject to his approval. But on the other hand, and this is again for his own good, the monarch will not have the right to express his opinion on anything that has not been submitted to him by his advisors. In Spinoza's well-ordered monarchy, I quote, "All law is explicit will of the king, but not everything willed by the king is law." The monarch must also remain as close as possible to the multitude. Spinoza gives several reasons for this. For example, that in the event of monarch's death, the state dies too, in a sense, and the supreme power naturally returns to the multitude. Or that the multitude freely transfers to a monarch only that which is absolutely beyond its capacity to possess, namely, I quote, "a facility for settling disputes and for making rapid decisions." The facility for making decisions. But be that as it may, Spinoza argues that a monarch is obliged to involve the people, to let them participate in the state's affair as much as possible, and to conduct all the business with the knowledge of the citizens. And so, Spinoza concludes that, I quote, "A people can preserve quite a considerable degree of freedom under a king, provided that it ensures that the king's power is determined only by the people's power and depends on the people for its maintenance." This is monarchy. If we now compare the three different logics of power in Spinoza, we must first admit that his death was indeed no accident. As Balibar has noted, democracy is rather a name for a certain conceptual blockade. This blockade is closely related to the problem that the state is a mode of how the multitude establishes a relation to itself, how, Spinoza says, it keeps it within certain borders. Consequently, according to Balibar, democracy is a self-contradictory concept. And this is probably the reason why Spinoza speaks of it in hypothetical terms. And he says, "For the absolute power, si quod datur," which is not certain, is really that which is held by the people as a whole. So, putting aside democracy, whose status is unclear, and which in the form of contemporary representative democracy resembles Spinoza's aristocracy anyway, the other two forms of government offer two different modes of governance, let us say two different logics of power. The inner principle of the aristocratic regime requires that all power should be in the hands of those who possess the necessary skills and know the relevant reasons. Every conclusion they reach is, as such, law. The people would be of no use here. On the contrary, they would only disturb those who know best and prevent them from reaching the best conclusion. In aristocracy, therefore, the logic of power is self-contained, based entirely on objective reasons, and external to those to whom it refers. In well-ordered monarchy, on the contrary, the task of governance is in principle split, divided between three different instances: the monarch, the councillors, and the people. In practice, the monarch's power exists in name only, while the real power lies in the hands of the councillors, or the government, who handle the technical side of the political job. They are the ones who possess the objective knowledge and skills. It must be remembered, however, that they govern on behalf of the monarch, and that without his "I will," to use this time Hegel's expression, their decrees have no binding force. The monarch has no right to act arbitrarily and is not allowed to pronounce any opinion on its own. In normal circumstances, his role is purely formal, one might say. Under certain conditions, however, the monarch's approval must assume a material role as well. Namely, if the councillors are unable to reach a conclusion, that is, if they happen to contradict each other, the final determination is up to monarch, who is supposed to supplant the objective reasons with the excessive moment of subjective decision. In this sense, the monarchical regime of knowledge is essentially subjectivized, as opposed to the aristocratic one, which is objective. At the same time, this regime of power is not external to the people. Since the independence of the monarch is itself dependent on the support of the multitude, it requires the political existence of the people. In short, in monarchy, as opposed to aristocracy, the logic of power is inherently public, immanent, and subjective. I think you see by now what my point and the proposed interpretation is. Namely, in describing the aristocratic and monarchical mode of existing power, Spinoza developed the logic of apolitical and the political state. And apolitical state is in Hegel Verstandesstaat, and the political state Vernunftstaat. But, and this is even more important, I hope you will also see that Spinoza's logic of aristocracy and the logic of monarchy correspond to two different conceptual regimes, which in Hegel are equally called Verstand und Vernunft. So, if our thesis, just one final remark, about the influence of Spinoza's political philosophy on the genesis or development of Hegel's speculative philosophy in the later Jena period is correct, this would have some interesting consequences. It would imply, for example, that Hegel managed to overcome Spinoza, that is his metaphysics, or what was considered to be his metaphysics, with the help of Spinoza himself, namely with the help of his political philosophy. It was Spinoza the political that helped Hegel to overcome Spinoza the metaphysician, or what was considered to be such. It would also mean that Hegel's philosophy is not political in its applications only, but that politics constitutes its internal logical structure, that political is the very form of its concept. In fact, even if this influence could not be verified finally or univocally, the conceptual analysis of Hegel's monarchy, for example, taking into account the status and institution of knowledge and the role of the monarch therein, would already prove, I think, this overlap between Hegel's logic and politics. In any case, I believe this influence was real. To me, it seems highly unlikely that Hegel would fail to see the systematic implications of the recent changes in his political theory. We have already touched on the following passage from the System of Ethical Life, System der Sittlichkeit. In der Sittlichkeit ist also das Individuum auf eine ewige Weise. Sein empirisches Sein und Tun ist ein schlechthin allgemeines. Denn es ist nicht das Individuelle, welches handelt, sondern der allgemeine, absolute Geist in ihm. Die Ansicht der Philosophie von der Welt und der Notwendigkeit, nach welcher alle Dinge in Gott sind und keine Einzelheit ist. Aber was ist also die Ansicht der Philosophie von der Welt und der Notwendigkeit, nach welcher alle Dinge in Gott sind und keine Einzelheit ist? Das ist Spinozismus, das ist Substanz. at least it was conceived. Also, die Ansicht der Philosophie ist für das empirische Bewusstsein vollkommen realisiert, indem jede Einzelheit des Handelns oder Denkens oder Seins ihr Wesen und Bedeutung ganz allein im Ganzen hat. So, in 802, Hegel's Spinozistically inspired Metaphysics of Absolute Substance and his conception of ethical substance, his metaphysics and his political theory were congruent, harmonized with each other. And as we have seen, Hegel drew an explicit parallel between the two in the quote just quoted. So, when his political philosophy changed, and that was around 803, this must have produced appropriate effects in his general philosophical system as well. That would be the thesis. Once he recognized that the individual must retain her independence against the ethical substance, das freie Tun, welches an sich heilig ist, this was bound to affect his overall view regarding the mode of being of the finite things. And the fact that thinking things to the end leads to an open contradiction would in this case no longer produce self-destruction as before, identity with the absolute. It would rather call for a tearing with the negative, which would transform it into something positive. And we will leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 3 questions and about 10-15 minutes. So more questions. Okay, so please.
Zdravko, thank you for this great instructive talk. I take a lot, and such a luck is that today is my turn. Yesterday you were talking about the missing role of the state, and now it's my turn to ask the labor, because I think that Hegel says in the philosophy of history that what allowed the beautiful democracy in Greece to flourish was the fact that the citizens were exempt from labor. And I think that it is a major difference that Hegel wrote in a time in which Adam Smith already wrote The Wealth of the Nations, and he understood the role of the labor in the modern state. And don't you think that it is a major difference between Spinoza and Hegel, or do you think that Spinoza also had a kind of idea and on the role of the labor in the modern state? What would you say?
Thank you. First, the role of the labor in Spinoza. Once again, I have to confess I'm not a Spinoza Spinozist. I have read many times Tractatus, politicus, but I don't really remember that there is a lot of discussion of this, and this is significant, but please correct me. Now, yes, and so this is a subject that is basically absent in Spinoza's political thought, and in fact, it is interesting to go deeper into the reasons for that, because Spinoza was nevertheless living in Holland, which was major Handelsstaat, industrial and financial center of the nation capitalism. So this strange missing link, the strange absence of the question of the labor is relevant, and I would thank you for that. Regarding Hegel, I said that as always in these changes, there were a lot of different lines of influence, different lines of thoughts that were effective at the same time. So it is always difficult to pick one. We do it to make the thing simpler, clearer. Hegel said, for instance, a great event, and development of Hegel's philosophy is a great event in the history, such as French Revolution, has always a multiple of causes, and understanding can pick up one of them and highlight it and determine it, call it the cause. But it's not the sole cause. So yes, there was the question of labor involved as well. Hegel read the English-Scottish philosophers of the new science of political philosophy, and Norbert Waschek made a wonderful book to put together the references. And it is clear that certain modes of rationality, that is even the list of Vernunft, is basically a version of market coordination. So yes, this is something that was definitely involved in Hegel's reception, I would say, of Spinoza. Not of Spinoza directly, but in Hegel's reception of Spinoza. That being said, there was also a curious, to me, very strange passages in early Hegel, where he in 82, ich glaube that it's about scientific ways of dealing the natural right, where he introduces two different types of Sittlichkeit, of ethical life, the absolute and relative one, and he divides the political existence between the two, and he includes following here probably Plato in excluding the workers, not necessarily the slaves, but the workers, to the, as he says, politische Nullität. So you're right, this line of thought could be integrated, I would say, in this narrative, because in fact the solution proposed in that natural right Schrift was obviously defective, and Hegel saw that cannot stand in the modern world. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why he then, this is a guess now, why didn't he adopted something like what I presented?
Okay, so now we have Professor Vivek, Professor Zankaulen. There's too many questions, and 10 minutes, please be short. Microphone? Okay, yeah.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich habe eine Anmerkung zu der These Abwendung vom antiken Modell. Diese Abwendung beginnt aus meiner Sicht schon in Frankfurt. Das ist nicht nur die Jena-Zeit. 3 Punkte. Der Verfassungsentwurf, den du zitiert hast, der ist schon in Frankfurt entworfen worden. Dann gibt es schon in Frankfurt eine scharfe Kritik an der Polystruktur. Beispiel altrömische Polystruktur. Das ist also nicht Jena-Entwicklung. Und das System der Sittlichkeit, das ist nicht belegt letztlich, ist eine Beschäftigung, wird belegt durch Jenaer Vorlesung, eine Beschäftigung mit einem Denker, der hier zu wenig thematisiert ist, das ist nämlich Fichte. Fichte, der beansprucht hat, ob zu Recht oder nicht, dass er das erste System der Freiheit entwickelt hat. Und wenn das Zitat kommt, ja, man muss auch als Subjekt das auffassen, das ist natürlich ein deutlicher Bezug zu Fichte, zu Fichtes Denken von Freiheit. Also ich bin etwas im Zweifel, ob da 1802 Spinoza diese entscheidende Rolle gespielt hat. Das geht schon Jahre vorher in Frankfurt.
Okay, darf ich? Okay. Es ging nicht von gestern nach heute und heute nach morgen. Aber ich habe das recherchiert und die Datierungen, wie sie stehen, heute, ich kann nicht dafür persönlich stehen, aber ich habe das nachgesehen. Und die Verfassungsentwurf ist nach der Referenzausgabe der gesammelten Werken eigentlich aus mehreren Schichten zusammengestellt. Und diejenigen, die von mir hier zitiert wurden, sind auf 803 datiert. Deswegen glaube ich, die Datierung und die Logik steht. Das alles nicht in diesem Sinne. Das habe ich, okay, man kann das nachsehen, aber so direkte Formulierungen gibt es meiner Meinung nach nicht.
Auch nicht in der Schrift. Okay, thank you. One more question. Okay, two more.
Miriam Bienenstock.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Nee,
Okay, so
Luca Bienenstock.
many questions. So, Luca.
Vielen Dank. Ich fand das außerordentlich interessant. Ich möchte eine kleine Bemerkung zum Anfang machen. Du hast begonnen mit dieser Hegel-Jacobi-Spinoza-Konstellation. Und in dem Zusammenhang hast du gesagt, wir haben entweder mit Spinoza eine mechanistische Metaphysik oder gar keine Philosophie, in Adresse auch an Hegels berühmte Formulierung, die er später gebraucht hat. Das ist nicht Jacobis Punkt. Es ist nicht die Frage, ob wir Spinoza haben oder gar keine Philosophie, sondern strukturell besteht die Herausforderung darin, die negative Beziehung, a negative relation, zu sehen innerhalb von Jacobis Doppelphilosophie. Er sagt Anti-Spinoza und er sagt später im Konflikt mit Fichte, die Dualität ist Alleinphilosophie oder Unphilosophie. Er sagt nicht Nicht-Philosophie. Nicht-Philosoph kann ich sein, indem ich überhaupt zu Hause bleibe oder fromm bin oder spazieren gehe. Aber wenn ich ein Unphilosoph bin, wenn ich ein Anti-Spinoza, ein Vertreter des Antispinozismus bin, dann habe ich immer die Bezüglichkeit. Und das bedeutet, den Widerspruch zu denken. Das ist strukturell sehr wichtig. Und im Deutschen haben wir dazu das Wort Unphilosophie. Ich weiß nicht, welche Entsprechung man dafür im Englischen machen kann. Non-Philosophy erfasst das nicht. Deshalb habe ich mir auch erlaubt, jetzt diese kleine Bemerkung auf Deutsch zu sagen. Es ist eine Spezialität, die strukturell dann auch eine Herausforderung für Hegel ist, wenn er sagt, wir müssen eine neue Logik entwickeln. Danke.
Okay, danke. Also es gibt so viele Variablen hier und es ist ziemlich schwer, das auseinanderzusetzen. Schon wenn man über den Spinozismus-Streit oder Pantheismus-Streit spricht, ist es ziemlich schwer zu differenzieren. Also the real Spinoza, Hegel Spinozas, Jacobi Spinozas. Dann wir haben in diesen Briefen nicht nur Spinoza, sondern wir haben und Jacobi, sondern wir haben auch Lessing und seine Argumentation. Dann wir haben eine sagen wir, argumentative Strategie. Und was ich als, sagen wir, einleuchtend, als einleuchtendes finde, ist Jacobis Weise der Argumentation, als er mit Spinoza gegen Spinoza argumentiert. Also mit der Philosophie gegen Philosophie. Alle die Konsequenzen. Ein Philosoph, wenn es konsequent ist, muss Spinozist werden. Das andere folgt von selbst. mit Spinoza alle die Konsequenzen von einem Standpunkt zu entwickeln. Und da sie sich als unakzeptabel erweisen, kann man diese Position eigentlich nicht nehmen. Und in diesem Sinne glaube ich doch, dass solche Weise der Demonstration zu einer Alternative leitet, wenn das die einzige Weise der philosophischen Demonstration ist, entweder Philosophie, entweder Spinozismus oder keine Philosophie. So. Ja, okay, ich weiß das.
Okay, one more, please, very short question, Professor Bina.
Yes, a very short question. Many thanks for your presentation, which I find extremely convincing. What I am just missing is an explanation of Hegel's concept of power. Because you talked a lot about power, Macht, and that's a concept Hegel may well have taken from Spinoza. And behind Spinoza, there was somebody else who was Hobbes, but then, and usually quite often, commentators relate Hegel's philosophy at that time in Jena to Hegel's political philosophy to Hobbes, but Hegel's concept of power changed at that time. So how do you see that concept at that time?
Okay, thank you very much. I must say that in this particular case, it was below my radar. I didn't follow it. I wasn't attentive enough. I know that later there is Macht, Gewalt, Kraft, so weiter. But in that, yes, okay, I will look into it. Thank you. I don't know.
Okay, now Professor Literati, very short, please.
Okay, very shortly. I found the contribution fundamental because I think that this reading that you proposed gives us the possibility to better understand one of the most difficult topics in the philosophy of right, and the paragraph on the notion of the monarch. And I wanted to ask you, in this paragraph, I'm referring to the paragraph 279, there are some notions that are intertwined, and I'm not sure to understand how to move into these different notions. So, Souveränität ist Subjektivität. And then, ist das Individuelle des Staats. And then, we have to have not an Individualität, aber ein Individuum, der entscheidet. Und so, Subjektivität, Individualität, Individuum, Entscheidung. Wie siehst du die Connection? How do you see the connection between these diverse determinations in the light of your contribution?
Oh, well, thank you. Regarding the monarch, I think that there is, in fact, even there is a conceptual parallel between Hegel's conception of concept and Hegel's conception of the state. This is, let's say, trivial. It must be so. Anything else would be against Hegel. Then that would mean that Hegel hasn't accomplished what he set to do. And I think that there are good reasons that his conception of monarch is as it is. It can in no way be the case of being complying to the Prussian state. this line is completely consistent from Jena to all the time. And okay, if to put just one, to single out just one notion, this is Individualität, ein Individuum. I think that it's very important that the monarch in Hegel is determined by birth, that it is not elected but given. Why? Because it is only in that way that the monarch functions as an exceeding element that is not derived from the people. The other, if it was elected, chosen as the best, then it would be expression of that people. Then there would be a conceptual linkage between the two. It would be a prolongation of the people. And in his conception, in Hegel's conception of the decision needed to overcome the contradiction, this decision has to be excessive. And this is why not that you don't need reasons why someone is monarch. You mustn't have any reason. It must be reasonless, without reason, pure positivity. And this is something that is given by nature. But there is also other, what is important is union itself.
Okay, I think we need to stop now. Thank you.